Hello and welcome to the video on course curriculum overview. In this video, we'll just have a short little discussion on all the topics covered in the course and the flow. So you will get overview of all the subjects or content that you're going to receive in this course. So let's get started. The first thing or the section that we have is your basic C++ syntax section. In this particular section, we have covered different topics that include maybe how to add comments in your C++ code, or some concepts like how to bring the cursor to the next line endl, or how do you make your C++ programs more user interactive. So how to work with user input in C++. So these are the some things that we have covered in the section of basic C++ syntax. Now, the next section that we have is about your variables and data types that we have in C++. So, what is a variable? Why do we use variables? The variable part is what you call the core crux of any programming language, not only in C++, but if you learn different programming languages like Java, Python, or C, or whatever you want, the variable part will remain the same. So how do you work with variables in C++, and what are different data types available in C++? Like what are different types of variables that you can create in C++? So these are your building blocks or foundation for the your programming journey that you will cover in the course. So variables and data types, some topics like strings or maybe character type variables or booleans, integers, floats, etc., have been covered in detail in this section. Moving on, the next topic we have is simply operators in C++. So operators are like basically your mathematical functions like addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. All these operators are covered in this section. So you have made variables, you are aware about different data types that you have. Now how do you operate within those data types and variables? That part will be covered in this section. So basically you can say that different types of mathematical calculations that can be done with the help of operators are covered here in the operators section. Next section that we have is about the loops and different conditional statements that we have in C++. Like you have if statements, if else statements, and then there's one more concept of if else ladder. So if you want to check multiple if and else conditions, we use a concept called if and else ladder. Then we have switch case, and moving on, these were all the statements. Moving on, we have different kinds of loop in C++ like for loop, while loop, do while loop. And next we have the break and continue statements or keywords that we add inside the loop to terminate the loop at a particular point. So those keywords are also covered, and each loop is covered in detail: for loop, while loop, do while loop, and your statements like if else and if else ladder and switch statements. So this was about the section number 5 of loops and statements. Moving on, the next section that we have is arrays in C++. So arrays is also a common topic in different programming languages like Java, C, and C++. And Python, you have arrays in the form of NumPy array, and also there is a concept called list in Python. But here we will restrict ourselves to arrays in C++. Like how do you work with arrays? How do you store data into an array? Or how do you retrieve data into an array? Or how do you calculate some of the elements of array? Or how do you change the elements present inside the array? All these concepts, or how do you store user input into the array? All these concepts are covered in detail in the section of arrays. Moving on, the most important concept of any programming language is how do you work with functions inside that particular programming language. And in C++, how to work with the return keyword in functions, or how do you define a function, or how do you call a function, what is difference between declaration and definition of the functions, and functions with parameters, functions without parameters, functions that return something, or functions that don't return, void type functions. So now all the basic things and somewhat advanced stuff in the functions have been covered inside this. And one more concept that we have discussed in this section is about the function overloading concept. How do you use the concept of function overloading? And after covering the basics of functions inside this particular section only, we have two more topics like pointers in C++, and then how to use recursion. Very important concept, recursion. That pointers and recursion also have been discussed in the functions sections. So function sections is very important. Moving on to the next thing, we have structures in C++. Now structures is very similar or a miniature definition for a next object oriented programming stuff, but all the concepts related to structures like what is the main difference between a structure and function, or how do you use enumeration in C++, like, or how do you store user input variable in structures, how do you declare a structure, or how can you store different data types like integer, string inside one structure, and how do you work with structure functions. All these have been covered inside the structures part in a C++ section number 8. Now after covering the structures, we have one section 9 called logical and conceptual questions in C++. So up till now we have covered different topics like structures, functions, pointers, recursion, loops, if statements, basic C++ syntax, or arrays, everything. This is a significant amount of content, and what we have done, we have introduced one section called logical and conceptual questions. Here in this section you will find different types of problems. We have given a total of 15 problems, like how do you perform searching on arrays, or how do you sort to an array, or how do you print different kind of patterns in C++, or how do you find some of different array elements, or let's say you want to reverse an array, or you want to find a largest element from the array. All these kind of different questions that use the concepts of your loops, conditional statements, arrays, functions. So a mixture of all the concepts, and the questions are designed very beautifully that will try to cover and test your different concepts that we have covered in the previous video sessions. So this section 9 is very important, logical and conceptual questions. Each and every question is detailed, is discussed in detail in the 15 different practice problem videos we have. So this was about your section number 9. And then after covering the concepts and after testing all the concepts and practicing different questions, we have our project number 1. So this is a complete C++ project, and because we haven't touched object-oriented programming in C++ till this section, I have chosen the topic of the project that does not cover the concepts of object-oriented programming. So project 1 will be based on the concepts that we have discussed, like function structures or arrays or something like this. So this will be your project number 1. Now moving on to next section, that is section number 11 of our course, the object-oriented programming. So object-oriented programming is you can call the heart of the OOP type programming languages. So basically you have two types of programming languages. One is your procedure-oriented programming language, and second one is your object-oriented programming language. The languages like C are procedural-oriented programming languages, and the languages like C++, Java, Python are object-oriented programming languages. So how do you build the object-oriented methodology, and what are different terms like classes, objects, or access specifiers or methods? The functions that we have covered in the previous section will now be referred as methods because they are linked to a class. So all these concepts, like we have few more concepts that are typically related to the object-oriented programming, like constructors, encapsulation, interfaces, all those inheritance, all those concepts have been covered here in the object-oriented programming. So object-oriented programming is a common term for different OOP languages like Java, Python, etc. But because we are studying specifically for C++, so the syntax that we'll be using will be related to C++, and all the concepts and all the features and functionalities that C++ provides us in OOP will be used over here. So this will be the very important section of the course. Now moving on, let's try to go few more topics of the OOP, like overloading in C++. Function overloading we have already studied in the functions part. Here we will study how to overload operator. So operator overloading will be considered in this section. Next we have inheritance, one of the most important topic of the object-oriented programming. So how do you use functionalities or variables or data of one particular class into a different class? So this all will be covered in inheritance. One more concept of object-oriented programming is have polymorphism, that is covered over here in this section. After completing the OOP part, we move to the error handling part. Like for example, let's discuss a mathematical scenario. So for example, if you are trying to perform any operation, and in that mathematical operation you are trying to divide a number by 0. So that is mathematically not valid because the answer will become infinity. If you try to divide a number by 0, the answer will technically become infinity. That is mathematically not possible. So how do you handle different kind of errors in C++? Like let's say a certain type of error happens in your program. So instead of terminating or the code stops running, you can just print a message that so and so error has happened. So this type of error handling is performed in this section of C++. Now, again, we have one more section for logical and conceptual questions. This time we have discussed 5 different questions that will be based on the concepts of OOP, object-oriented programming, like inheritance, polymorphism, abstract classes, constructors, etc., etc. So these questions that are included in this section, logical and conceptual questions, part 2, that is section number 16, will be based on OOP concepts. Here the array functions will be used as a sub-concept, or few keywords will be used from all the arrays or functions type, but main logic of the questions will be based on OOP, like inheritance or something like that. So this was the next section, and moving on, we have project number 2. Now this project number 2 is completely based on stack data structure. So you will also get idea of stack data structure. Before directly moving on to the coding of the project 2, we have some videos that will explain not the C++ and OOP part, but what is a stack and how do you use a stack data structure. If you are not aware about the concept of data structures, we have one dedicated video that will explain the concept of data structures, and then we'll move to the coding part. So this was about project number 2. Next topic we have is file handling. So how do you work with files through your C++ programming? Like for example, usually up till now when we'll be doing our coding part, so we'll be typing our code on the terminal or the IDE or the online compiler that we are using, and after doing the code, when we close the terminal or IDE or compiler, the data will be vanished. But for example, if I want to store a particular message into a file, so how do I write data into files through my C++ programming, or how do I read some text from my files and I want to use it into my code, or I want to print that text on the screen through my C++ code through a text file. So all these concepts will be discussed here in the concept of file handling. Now next topic we have is the concept of dynamic memory allocation in C++. So some keywords like new or delete will be covered over here. Like we won't take the predefined memory for our C++ code, but memory will be allocated dynamically at the runtime based on the requirement of our program in the dynamic memory section. This is a little bit more technical, so I will not discuss it in very detail over here, but this will be very clear when you move to section number 19 of dynamic memory in C++. Next we have namespaces in C++. Again, how do you define namespaces, or what is a namespace, or using namespace or nested namespaces? Everything has been covered in the section number 20 of namespaces in C++. Next we have our project number 3. All the concepts used in the course, like from OOP to arrays to functions to XYZ, whatever have been discussed in the course, all the things will be used in the project number 3. Next we have advanced C++ introduction. Some topics, because this is just the introduction for advanced C++, some topics like templates or preprocessors or signal handling through C++ have been discussed over here in advanced C++ introduction. And last and finally we have a C++ questions and answers video. This section contains different questions and answers that are used for your interview. If you go, once you're done with the course and you're clear with all the concepts, we have tried to cover some typical interview questions that are asked very frequently for C++. So this is the complete content overview of the course, what you will be getting, and the course overflow that you can expect throughout your journey. I wish you all the best for this course, and now let's get started and move to the next video. Thank you.